Thank you so very much for Achim Steiner for being here with us today. Achim, as you heard, has got a very impressive background in trying to save the world, so let's continue that. As do our youth ambassadors, thank you so very much for being here today, and over to you.
Hi, it's really exciting to get to talk to you and ask you questions. So I'm currently a plaintiff on a federal lawsuit against the U.S. federal government brought by young people to sue the government for their actions taken to perpetuate climate change. What do you think about the case, and do you see potential to replicate this case locally and globally to spark court-mandated action on climate?
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm very impressed that you're already engaged in a lawsuit, because I think one of the things that are at the heart of climate change when it comes to law, justice, and even constitutional law is this dilemma of intergenerational fairness and equity. And I think many of our legal systems are not really geared very well to deal with the phenomenon that one generation's decisions literally will preclude, foreclose the right to resources, to making choices in the next generation. And I think that is why we are seeing, particularly through the issue of climate change, a far greater sense of wanting to draw on the judiciary process to challenge government policy. What you're doing with your colleagues in New York is something that is actually beginning to happen in many countries around the world. And we had a very famous law case or court case in the Netherlands last year, which I'm sure you're very familiar. There are now 9,000 co-plaintiffs actually taking the Belgian government to court. And I think we will see also in the litigation domain with individual actors and their decisions, these issues being taken up far, far more in the years to come. Now, the question will be, in the case of your lawsuit as well as others, what is the right to which you're actually referring to in terms of your local standi? And I think this is where taking international covenants on economic, social and cultural rights, for instance, taking international treaty law, will in part also strengthen the ability of people to take issues about climate change through their national judiciary, even if there is no immediate constitutional provision. And I think that is where precedent is now being set and where the rule of law and the environment and climate change are rapidly evolving as a field.
Thank you so much for being here. So I'm a young person that is passionate about being part of the generation that solves climate change. So I was wondering, what specific message do you have for young people around the world to inspire them in making that a reality?
Well, at its simplest, don't take a no for an answer. You know, I have now spent the better part of 3 decades in a landscape that when I entered it as a young economist, a development economist, was constantly being told that this is just the way things are. For instance, if you want to develop, you have to harm the environment. The price you pay for rapid growth is social inequity, but you know, with time it will correct itself. My argument would be any young person who right now sits on a podium, sits in a classroom, in a public debate, challenge those who say this is the way it's got to be. Part of what is happening around us in our societies right now is in fact not just young people, but older people getting fed up with being told that the laws of the market, the economic principles, how things work, demand of us that we accept things to happen. When it comes to climate change, there is absolutely no reason why we should not, by the year 2050, succeed in decarbonizing our economies. It's a matter of choice, of freedom to choose different pathways. And you, as the generation that will very soon set the tone of this debate, don't take no for an answer. Challenge those who say this is the paradigm, these are the rules of the game. No, they're not. They can be challenged. And I think if we had more time, we could go through a number of examples of how we are actually already succeeding.
That was great. I'm nervous what a Trump presidency might mean for the United States' role in the Paris Climate Agreement implementation. What are your thoughts?
So far, not many, because it's very difficult to predict what will be, just down the road from the World Bank, a viewpoint that this administration that is going to take the United States forward over the next 4 years will take on climate change issues. We have seen that in the election campaign, many things have been said, and now a different phase in the political process kicks in. I think a President Trump will, at the end of the day, have to look not only at the politics of the climate change debate in the United States. That was during the election campaign. What a president who acts in the interests of the American people, America's economy, America's national security, will very quickly realize is that if the United States were to not be part of an international climate effort, it not only isolates itself, it actually compromises itself. Because there is, based on the science available to us today, no question that the United States will be affected by climate change. In fact, the United States statistics already show that at federal, state level, and local level, tens of millions of dollars are being invested right now just in coping with communities who can no longer stay where they have stayed for decades or even hundreds of years. The impacts, the economic implications, the disruption of climate change will very quickly focus the mind, I think, of the incoming administration on why accelerated action on climate change is not only essential from a national security, a national economic point of view, and let me here just say, the United States now has millions of jobs that are actually a result of investing in this low carbon economy pathway. And thirdly, from an international perspective, because if US companies are going to compete in a global marketplace that is heading towards low carbon technology, and the United States would be selling, let's say, car technology, industrial technology of the 1990s to a market in 2025, it does not take much imagination that it wouldn't get very far. So I think these are some of the reasons why we will have to wait and see how much the politics of electioneering will be, let's say, recalibrated in the face of the really hard decisions an incoming administration must take on behalf of this nation.
Okay. So most social movements, for example, the Arab Spring, Dreamers movements, equal marriage, civil rights, were all successfully started by young people. What do you, if anything, see as standing in the way of a huge movement building up around climate change?
Well, first of all, we already have a huge movement. I think there are few issues that have, in just 2 decades, reached every corner of the world. I mean, whether it is people who are fighting for reducing deforestation in some of our most vital tropical forest systems, whether it is the Amazon or in the heart of Africa or in Asia, whether it is people who are looking at how communities can change the way they run their energy systems. And again, in Marrakesh, we saw a group of vulnerable countries being at the forefront of committing to 100% renewable energy. I think young people have the power to make this movement not only be heard, but actually to make it succeed. Much of what we now see in this changing economic setting is also opportunity. You know, renewable energy is the antithesis to the last 100 years of an economic model of producing energy that basically meant that a nation either had a national utility which controlled the entire electricity production, or it was a monopoly or an oligopoly of 3 or 4 companies, because you had to have capital, it was centralized, and only big players could decide what kind of technology would be used. Today you can start producing your own electricity. You can take steps to reduce your consumption. And these are the kinds of things where I think power to the young people to show that we can actually make a difference with the decisions we take right now. And out of that, I think, comes further momentum for giving people the confidence that we can actually make this transition. I think our biggest problem right now is that we have all the science and all these economic arguments of why it's so difficult. We feel like we have our backs against the wall, and yet we have shown already in the renewable energy field that we can turn an entire industry upside down in just 10 years. That's what's happening now. And there are countries now producing 30, 40, 50% of their national electricity with renewables. Considered impossible 15 years ago. If you were a young graduate coming out of university, either as an engineer or as an economist, you probably wouldn't have been employed in the mainstream if you had argued for that. Today, you're at the forefront of technology and economic change. So those are just a few reflections on that.
So I think you're really getting into this with your answer to that question. Why do you see young people as critical in winning the fight against climate change?
First of all, because you are less likely to give up. I think one of the problems with getting older is that you become less willing to challenge the status quo. It's the great privilege of young people to say, why should we do things the way you guys have done? I've spent the better part of my working life being socialized in a context where people told me, this is how it is, and it can't be different. And I think that privilege of not being socialized in the, I can't do anything about it mode is an immense power. Secondly, you have the greatest vested interest in getting something changed right now. I might say, well, I can happily survive the next 30 to 40 years on this planet, and we may even be able to grow some good grapes in the United Kingdom. People make these funny arguments about, isn't it great to be able to grow strawberries in Greenland and potatoes in Norway as a sign of how nice a little bit of climate change and global warming would be. It's at that level of naivety that we sometimes have to discuss things. And I would argue young people are both a constituency that has a vested interest. Secondly, it has a greater inclination to challenge the status quo. And thirdly, this is your economy. This is your opportunity to be an innovator, to be a change agent. And therefore, you have every reason to be at the forefront of this climate change movement. And again, people will continuously discourage you with lots of arguments. And some of them are not necessarily invalid, but they are never absolute reasons to do and go on doing something that's wrong, simply because that's the way others have done it before you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And most young people aren't legal experts, but we are also the most at risk when it comes to climate change and the decisions that the government makes about those things. What advice do you have for us in using the legal system to deal with the risk of climate change for our generation?
You might laugh, but my answer is get a lawyer. And, being at the Law, Justice and Development Week here, there's a lot of lawyers here. But let me explain why that's not just a silly answer. It's actually a very serious answer. Law and the study of law and jurisprudence, and in the case of climate change and the environment, this emerging field of the environmental rule of law, is not just people talking complicated language. Law is in part about the incredibly difficult task of combining choices, values, precedent with legally justifiable decisions. Now, as we know, law is a strange thing because under constitutional law in countries, slavery was considered legitimate. Having women not vote was considered legitimate, but it was also ultimately challenged in constitutional terms and changed. And I think that is why it is important to, when you're a young person, to recognize that the study of law, and with it lawyers, the practitioners, are experts in helping you frame your case. And at the end of the day, law is not a matter of dictates alone. It is actually something that creates transparency and accountability. And if you want to succeed, then you have to ultimately go into a court of law or some form of litigation, which will require the expertise to do so. The only advice I can give you on top of that is pick the right lawyer, because one of the challenges I have found is that, law, as many of you know, is not a science. It is actually a discipline, a field of work in which interpretation is as much part of something as it is also trying to reflect how law should correspond with and give expression to the values of our generation. So there are many lawyers, but not every lawyer will take you to where you want to go with your case. And that is why I think do go to the experts, but make sure that you have the right expert, because with that you have just seen in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in many countries, including here in the United States, the Natural Resource Defense Council, many others who have used the law to essentially get governments to either acknowledge their responsibility for something that has happened or to change policy because it is no longer in line with the fundamental rights of people, however they may be justified in legal terms.
Well, thank you. We're really excited to talk to you. We're really grateful for your hope in our generation, and we reflect that back at hope in the institutions which you represent and the ideas that you hold. We're really excited to continue on with this week and to learn more about how teenagers like us could be working in the systems to make sure that we get the sustainable future that we've been looking for, and we're excited that we got to discuss it with you first.
Well, thank you guys, and just to show that I actually meant what I just said is I think it is in your hands, and I have just chosen to go back to a university because I think there I find the people who I think will need the skills and the outlook to be able to do the kind of work that you're already doing before you've even got to university. So thank you for what you do. It's very inspiring, and I hope many out there will see that it doesn't take age to have a voice in this debate. So keep going. Thank you.
Thank you.